I usually don't ask this early, but if you could like the video and subscribe, it would mean a lot. We're so close to hitting 1,000 subscribers, and your support can really help get my content out there. Thanks. James Hargrove. A 35-year-old marketing executive from Manchester, loyal, hardworking, and deeply in love with his wife. He has a sharp mind for business and prides himself on being practical and grounded. His steady nature contrasts with the emotional whirlwind that will soon engulf him. Emily Hargrove. A 32-year-old interior designer who loves the finer things in life. She's vivacious, charming, and always up for a night out with friends. Though she once adored James, she's begun to crave something more exciting, and this thirst for thrill leads her down a dangerous path. Mark Walters. A 38-year-old wealthy businessman who thrives on adventure and risk. He's charismatic, handsome, and manipulative, knowing exactly how to woo women like Emily. He exudes confidence, and his forbidden allure is what draws Emily toward him. James Hargrove thought he had it all: a loving wife, a good job, and a future filled with promise. He and Emily had been married for 7 years, building a life together in their suburban Manchester home. To James, they were the perfect couple. They laughed together, traveled when they could, and shared their dreams of starting a family soon. But behind closed doors, things weren't as perfect as they seemed. Emily had changed. What was once spontaneous passion turned into routine, and the connection they had in their early years now felt like a distant memory. James, ever trusting, chalked it up to the natural progression of a long-term relationship. Everyone hit rough patches, right? But little did he know, the change in Emily wasn't just a phase. It was something much deeper, something he was about to uncover in the most devastating way possible. James sat in the kitchen, his laptop open, sipping his coffee as he replied to some work emails. Emily was out, again. Lately, she'd been out more and more, saying she was catching up with old friends, or had interior design projects that required late-night consultations. James had never doubted her before, but he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. It started small. Emily's phone, which used to sit on the kitchen counter or by her side, was now always in her hand, face down. The once loving texts she'd send him throughout the day had become brief and to the point. Conversations about their future had dwindled, and the playful banter that once filled their evenings had given way to silence. One night after Emily had come home unusually late, James decided to ask her directly. "Emily, is everything okay between us?" His voice was soft, filled with concern. She looked up from her phone, her face a mask of indifference. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. You've just been distant lately." Emily sighed and set her phone down. "James, it's nothing. I've just been busy with work. You know how demanding clients can be." James wanted to believe her, but his gut told him otherwise. Yet, he nodded, not wanting to push the issue further. It wasn't long after that conversation when James met Mark Walters for the first time. He and Emily had been invited to a dinner party hosted by one of her friends, Sarah, in the city center. James had never been particularly fond of these social gatherings, but he knew Emily enjoyed them. So, he went along. The party was held in Sarah's lavish flat in Deansgate, filled with people James didn't recognize. As the evening wore on, James found himself in a conversation with a group of men discussing football, while Emily flitted about, charming everyone with her wit and laughter. She looked radiant that night, in a sleek black dress that hugged her figure perfectly. James couldn't help but admire her from across the room. It was during one of those moments of admiration that James noticed a man watching Emily, a tall, dark-haired man with a sharp jawline and an expensive suit. James caught his eye and smiled politely, but the man didn't reciprocate. Instead, he continued to watch Emily with an intensity that made James uneasy. Later in the evening, Emily introduced him. "James, this is Mark Walters. He's an old friend of Sarah's. Mark, this is my husband, James." Mark extended his hand, his grip firm but cold. "Nice to meet you, James. I've heard a lot about you." James smiled politely. "All good things, I hope." "Of course," Mark replied, though there was something in his tone that James didn't like. The rest of the evening passed without incident, but James couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about Mark. He seemed too interested in Emily, and the way Emily laughed at his jokes, the way her hand rested on his arm just a little too long, made James uneasy. But once again, James pushed the thoughts aside. Emily was his wife. She loved him. She wouldn't betray him like that. Over the next few weeks, James noticed more changes in Emily. She was more secretive, more withdrawn, and whenever he asked her about her day, her answers were vague. One night, James decided to surprise her with a romantic dinner at home. He cooked her favorite meal, lasagna, and set the table with candles and their best silverware. He waited for her to come home, eager to rekindle the romance that seemed to be slipping away. But Emily didn't come home, not until nearly midnight, and when she did, she was distant, distracted. "Where were you?" James asked, trying to keep his voice calm. "Work ran late," she replied curtly, barely glancing at the candle-lit table. James looked at her, his heart sinking. "I made dinner. I thought we could spend some time together." Emily glanced at the table, then back at James. "I'm not hungry. I'm exhausted, James. I'm going to bed." As she walked past him and up the stairs, James felt a pang of helplessness. The woman he loved was slipping away from him, and he didn't know how to stop it. James couldn't ignore the signs anymore. He didn't want to believe that Emily was cheating, but the evidence was mounting. She was gone more often, her affection had cooled, and every time Mark Walters' name came up, she seemed to light up in a way she didn't with him anymore. One evening, while Emily was out working late, James decided to check her phone. She'd left it on the counter while she was in the shower. His hands trembled as he picked it up, his heart pounding in his chest. He unlocked the phone, feeling a pang of guilt, but his suspicions were confirmed almost immediately. There were messages from Mark, flirty, suggestive messages that made James feel sick to his stomach. Mark: "I can't wait to see you tonight. That dress you wore last time, wear it again. It drives me wild." Emily: "I was thinking of something a little more daring tonight." James stared at the screen, his hands shaking, bile rising in his throat. His worst fears had come true. Emily was cheating on him. And worse, she didn't even seem to care about hiding it anymore. He placed the phone back on the counter, his mind racing. What was he supposed to do now? Confront her? Demand an explanation? But as he stood there, another thought entered his mind. What if he could catch her in the act? The night that everything changed was a cool autumn evening, much like any other. James had come home earlier than usual, feeling uneasy after discovering those messages. He didn't want to confront Emily just yet. He wanted to see for himself, to confirm what he already knew deep down. As he approached their house, he noticed that the bedroom light was on, a soft golden glow spilling through the blinds. James parked the car and sat there for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. Something felt off. He stepped out of the car and walked toward the house, keeping to the shadows. When he reached the side of the house, he looked up at the bedroom window, and that's when he saw it. Through the small gap in the curtains, James saw Emily standing in front of the mirror, wearing a lingerie set he'd never seen before. She was laughing, her head thrown back in a way that made James's stomach twist with jealousy and pain. And then he saw Mark. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, watching her with a smug smile on his face. Emily turned to him, her hands moving seductively over her body as she performed a striptease, something she hadn't done for James in years. James felt a lump rise in his throat. His hands clenched into fists. His entire world shattered in that moment. The woman he had loved, the woman he had trusted with his heart, was giving herself to another man right in their own bedroom. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. All he could do was watch as Emily removed her lingerie piece by piece until she stood naked in front of Mark, who reached out to touch her. That was enough. James turned away, his heart racing, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, betrayal, sadness, disbelief. It all hit him at once, a wave of pain that left him breathless. James didn't confront them that night. He couldn't. Instead, he drove to a hotel and checked in, his mind numb with shock. He couldn't believe what he had seen. The woman he had loved for so long, the woman he had built a life with, had betrayed him in the most intimate way possible. The next morning, he went home, packed a bag, and left a note for Emily. "I know everything. Don't bother coming after me." And just like that, James walked away from the life he had built with Emily. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He could never go back to the way things were. Thank you for reading this heart-wrenching tale of betrayal, heartbreak, and the courage to walk away from a toxic relationship.